Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to the Siegel building here at SFU's downtown campus. I want to begin today by acknowledging that we are privileged to be doing this work today on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And my name is Fred Popowich, and I'm the Scientific Director of SFU's Big Data Initiative. And on behalf of Simon Fraser University, I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the Spring 2019 Data Visionaries series. It's a series dedicated to the bringing together pioneers in the field who are shaping and reshaping the world we live in. I encourage you to join us in online conversation today as well as in person here, so feel free to have your mobile devices switched on, but in silent mode. Aside from everybody on the stage, we decided we were in a no-tweet mode on the stage here in terms of that, so we didn't want our phones vibrating on the mics and so on. And in terms of that, if you are tweeting, you can use the Twitter hashtags, #SFU and #DataVisionaries. Don't use the hashtag fake news, or maybe we can. We'll see what happens. You just get lost in the noise of all that. So, yeah, so from fake news to foreign press to political interference to maybe informed truths, big data that we have all around us is really changing how we perceive and participate in our democracies. And really, it's this social media really is playing a large role now in the dissemination of information, and mainstream media and communication technologies continue to have a vital role in shaping and reshaping our public discourse. So, in bringing everyone together today, we are here today to discuss the question, as we discussed it here, citizen trust in the disinformation age. And we are pulling together quite the panel for being able to speak to this from a range of different backgrounds. We're going to basically be taking a look at, like I said, fake news, emerging technologies, industry, and public policy, and seeing how it does affect citizen trust. And I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists, and I'll start at the far end there by introducing my colleague from Simon Fraser University, Maite Taboada, who is a professor in the Department of Linguistics at SFU. Her research combines discourse analysis and computational linguistics with an emphasis on discourse relations and sentiment analysis. Her team recently created the Gender Gap Tracker. This is a great thing that you can just type in Gender Gap Tracker, you'll find the online links to it, no problem. It's a new tool to track in real time the number of women and men quoted in major news platforms in Canada. I'm sure if we clicked on it right now, we'd see most of the things being quoted there is probably like 80% women, 20% men, right?
It's about 3 to 1.
Yeah, the other way around.
Yes, 3 to 1, the way you would expect, yes.
Yes, yeah. So Maite, thank you for joining us today. Next to her is Andrew Franklin, sorry, I'm going to the wrong notes here. Andrew is the Vice President of Canadian Digital Operations for Black Press Media. During his 20 years with Black Press Media, more than 100 awards have been conferred on publications and websites he has managed, including top community newspaper awards in Canada and in the US. And he is recognized with numerous innovation awards for Canadian media and is a Paul Harris Fellow. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Next to Andrew, we have Sue Wheatley, who is the Executive Director of the Integrated Data Division with the BC Ministry of Citizen Services. She decided she had to come over to Vancouver for the good weather because, it's even better weather than Victoria here, right? Always, yes, yeah. But at the BC Ministry of Citizen Services, she's focused on collaboration and trust at the intersection of data and digital transformation. Previously, she led the development of BritishColumbia.ca, BC's data-driven investment attraction platform, and worked with partners across BC's key sectors and communities to promote BC's competitive advantages. Finally, next to me here is Christin Wiedemann. She is the president of Radical IO Technology. There, she provides strategic leadership by establishing long-term goals, strategies, plans, and policies. She is a passionate advocate for women in STEM, a passion she pursues through her work and volunteering. She's been on the board of directors for the Society for Canadian Women in Science and Technology since 2015, and in 2018 she took on the role of co-chair of the BC chapter of Women in Communications and Technology. So to start, let's first thank our 4 panelists for joining me here on stage. Now we get to sit back in the comfy chairs and that. I'm sorry that we tried to get from CBC those big red chairs that they used to have for their late, but they're just too expensive. We were on a limited budget for that. So we'll have to be comfortable in our slightly smaller chairs here. And the way we're going to structure this is we're going to have about a 45-minute panel session where we have some initial questions to get some discussion going. We'll be talking, probably structured in around 3 general areas, having our panel members respond to that. But in the meantime, you're all supposed to be thinking of good questions to ask the panelists, because we're then going to turn it over to you to come up with some questions. And because I'm a professor, if you're not taking notes, there'll be an exam afterwards, and we're going to, no, honest, we won't be doing that. But in terms of that, then we can turn it over to the panelists to answer some of your questions. And then afterwards is where the real fun starts, is that's when those empty tables there miraculously become full of things that we can eat and drink, and then we can have continued discussion around the room afterwards. So to get us kicked off, this was just like it was a no cell phone zone for us on stage, it was a no PowerPoint zone for us on stage. I was really advocating that we work for old style technology. I have one of these things as a backup in case my old technology actually fails here in terms of my notes, in case my eyes give out and things like that. But I wanted to turn it over to our panelists to start, to allow them to say a bit more about themselves, because there's no way I could sum up I probably didn't pick the right stuff to talk about each of them for 1 minute. So I'll let each of them talk about themselves for 1 minute to give an introduction to who they are and what they do, and then sort of give them probably about 4 minutes each to sort of state their position on the issues that we're discussing for tonight. So Christine, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you, Fred, for the introduction, and thank you, SFU, for bringing us all together here tonight. So my name is Christin Wiedemann, and my formal training is in particle physics, which I studied at Stockholm University in Sweden. And I did a doctoral thesis on ultra-high energy neutrinos, which meant that I did a lot of data simulation and data analysis, which basically meant I wrote software. So I got introduced to neural networks and grid computing when I was doing my doctoral thesis back in, let's say 20 years ago, more or less. And once I graduated, I started working as a software developer and then as a software tester. And for the last 6 years, I've been working in different leadership roles in the software industry in Vancouver. And as Fred mentioned, I am definitely very passionate about diversity. And for the last 20 plus years, I've been working in different volunteer roles trying to promote primarily gender diversity, but diversity and inclusion in general. And I currently work for Radical.io, where our vision is an equitable society where people have access to relevant information when they need it. And I don't think there's any doubt that tonight's topic is very important, and we all care about it. That's why we're here. And I really look forward to spending the next couple of hours discussing it. But there are a couple of things on my mind that I would like to mention before we get started. And the first is that approaching a topic like this, we tend to assume that we're in the right. We define what's fake and what's true and what trust means. And that strikes me as being rather presumptuous and of course also very subjective. It's my truth and my trust. And for each of us, it means something slightly different. And we know that it's not that easy. There isn't necessarily an absolute truth. And I think that more than ever now, the lines are getting blurred. And what we mean by true and false is changing. And the world is becoming more and more complicated. And I think as humans, our natural response to that is to try to make the world simpler. And how do we make it simpler? Well, a lot of the time we do that by trying to narrow our definitions of right and wrong. And we try to impose more rigid definitions and constraints of what that means. Whereas what I think we really need is to make those definitions broader and less rigorous. And we need to be more willing to adapt our own definitions and to revise and change them. Because my fear is that it's going to be diversity and open-mindedness that's going to pay the price. And that we're once again going to use conformity and homogeneity to use them as tools to decide what is good and what is bad. And I think we're all aware of that historically, that hasn't played out very well. And that is really what terrifies me personally the most. So we have access to more data than ever. But instead of using that data and that diversity of data, we tend to restrict our content. And I think that is absolutely the wrong approach. The thing about truth is that it tends to be hard and messy and inconvenient. And we can't sacrifice equity for the sake of finding easy and comfortable answers. So what I'm really hoping for tonight is that we're not going to try to find answers as much as asking better questions. And to ask questions that are going to help move us forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much. A great way to get us kicked off here. So, Sue, over to you now.
All right. I'm Sue. Nice to meet you all. So I describe myself as a curious public servant. I typically in these types of venues, I feel like I have the least number of degrees, which I've come to accept and just name it and get over the imposter syndrome that I think a lot of people can feel. So I'm a curious public servant. I've been in government for about 5 years, which makes me feel new, and I hope that I never lose that perspective of feeling like a bit of an outsider in government. Curious because I'm always trying to connect dots and find ways to make more sense of things for myself and for others. So what I do in government now is I work within the Ministry of Citizen Services, specifically the Office of the Chief Information Officer, and even more specific than that, it's about integrated data. So I say I've only been in government for 5 years, but obviously I'm doing a great job getting very bureaucratic. But really what this comes down to, and the reason why it connects with the curiosity piece, is that I can see that data can open up so many doors. And most specifically, I think like the reason why I was invited here tonight is the connections made between data literacy, and this is a piece of work that I'm doing within the public service. So there's about 30,000 public servants, and one of the things within my purview is trying to increase data literacy in government. Because there are so many skills that are required and so much opportunity with data. To the point that you just made about asking better questions, to me that's going to be one of the toughest things to be able to do, and understand the bounds of what you can ask and when to call BS. I don't know you very well, so maybe I won't say the real word that I want to use, but I think that there's an incredible opportunity. So for the connection for data literacy and why I'm here tonight is that through the work that I've been doing, I've kind of had a little bit of a soapbox with my team and with the people that I meet in government that we need to do this so desperately within government to be able to make better decisions on programs and policy. But if we truly want to be able to serve the public, which is my #1 job, then I would argue that we also need to extend that literacy. And I do hate the word literacy for this because the opposite implies zero knowledge. But I believe that it is understanding data, learning how to call BS, learning how to interpret, learning how to seek information to further inform your own truth. That is a skill that I think that not everybody automatically has. There's so much data, there's so much information that's out there. And my view is that that understanding data and information is a bit of a civic competency that I think that is really exciting, because I think that in the coming years, this I'm hoping is going to be a bit of a no-brainer, not much of a foreign concept, that everybody should be able to have these skills. So that's why I'm here today, and I'm excited to hear what comes up tonight. As the curious public servant, I'm here to learn. So I always leave events like this and meetings with different people really energized and full of ideas to see how I can bring them back to what I do.
Great. Thanks a lot, Sue. Over to you, Andrew.
All right. So just a bit more about me. Call me crazy. This is my 30th year in media, and started in the UK for newspapers around the London belt, and then moved to Canada. And I've been working with Black Press Media ever since. And just to set the scene, most of my background has been as a publisher or regional publisher. So I've connected with a lot of people over the years. And recently I've been really focused more on the digital channels and leading the charge on the digital side for the company as a whole. And just to give you an idea of scale, I'm responsible for Canadian operations, but we are also in many US states, and including Alaska, Washington, California, and we're also in Hawaii. And we often have new recruits coming to the company saying, "You're in Hawaii? I'll volunteer." But I've seen a lot of Canadian staff go to Hawaii and they come back very quickly. They're not on the beach. They don't spend all the time in a very relaxed way. So it's not quite what you think it may be. So we're the largest media operation as far as journalism is concerned. We have 185 journalists in British Columbia any one day. And, generating 400 to 500 stories per day. It's a lot of content. And we have somewhere in the region of 3.7 million uniques coming to our websites every month. So that kind of sets the size and scale that we're operating. And in order for me to answer the questions that we were talking about, first of all, we have to really understand how social media, traditional media, and local media converge. They all do provide very different functions in terms of gathering content, specifically news. The one word that resonates the most in discussions is the level of trust associated with each media type. Social provides this massive platform with 2 billion active users on Facebook alone, with an array of content from family-based information through to eyewitness accounts of the news, through to opinion, and finally misinformation. This can be either deliberate in nature or simply through lack of research. In both examples, a lack of factual content can be shared very quickly. In our company, we really push an assertive approach to moderating content. When it comes to national traditional media, trust issues, for example, in the US, arise when content reflects politics more than anything else. And it doesn't really take too much to think about, CNN and Fox to give you a quick example of that. There's no question that bias, misinformation is occurring. We all know it. Not all traditional media can be viewed in the same way. However, traditional media can be reflected in the same way regarding social media. And an example really more close to my heart, because we are a collection of a lot of local community media operations, is with Facebook. And when you look at the local websites and the local newspapers, they're still very tightly measured, monitored, and controlled. But when you move into the social media sphere, it's much more difficult for us to control that content. We certainly do our best, but it is much more challenging. And clearly we have options to ban people, to hide people, to respond to people. But I'm sure you all know what happens, if you ban somebody from Facebook and they feel that they have an opinion, that's not the last that you're going to hear from that person. And as a footnote, just to wrap up, I thought it was quite ironic. Just before I got here, I did a search on Google for fake news websites, and in 51 seconds, the result was 200 million websites. So I thought that was kind of amusing. But anyway, that's just a start.
Oh, great context for setting this. And I know that data is now out of date because there's now more.
Exactly.
Exactly. Maite, over to you.
Thank you, Fred. Thanks for hosting. It's lovely to be here with the panelists. And it's great to see so many people interested in this topic tonight. So that good for you for being here. Wanted to talk a bit about my research and what I do. I'm a linguist, so I study language. I'm interested as a theoretical linguist in how people use language to communicate, and more importantly, how we make what we say coherent, how we weave conversations together, how we write whatever it is that we're writing, from tweets to essays, and how that makes sense in context. But more specifically, I'm a computational linguist, so that means I use computers to analyze language. And most of what I do is it just hinges on one basic idea, that we can use language analysis to distinguish different types of texts. And what I've been doing lately is using computational linguistics to try and tell fake news from real news based on the language. So if you read a news story, can you tell that it's a fake story just from the types of words used, from the turns of phrase, maybe from even the use of punctuation? I use similar techniques to distinguish the constructive from the nasty comments on online news stories. So in my lab, we have developed a system to identify comments that are constructive, that contribute to the conversation, and that make that conversation better, as opposed to, all the other things that you know about happen online. So I wanted to start with a preface that a lot of what I'm saying tonight comes informed from my research and from the readings that I've done on this topic. A lot of it is my thoughts as a private citizen and one that is worried about what is happening. So to start, I just have 2 points. One is we have been here before. Every time we have introduced a new mode of communication, we have worried about what it's going to do to us, and more importantly, what is it going to do to our children. And we have dealt with it before. The difference today is that news and terrible content spreads much faster online, and it reaches many more people. But we have dealt with problems like this before. And that's why I think it's important to bring all kinds of people into the conversation. Conversations about technology usually have technology experts and data experts. But I think historians would be very good people to bring into the conversation, political scientists, sociologists. So we need all of those heads put together. My second point is about exactly what it is that we're talking about when we talk about fake and content and misinformation online, and how we are going to hold platforms accountable for it. Like you said about moderating the content that appears on your site. The thing is that social media platforms do a lot. They publish, they become publishers of news. They distribute news published or written by other organizations, but they also host conversations online. They host the conversation that you're holding with your grandchildren or with your friends. So I think those are 2 very different things, and I think we need to hold them accountable for what passes as news on those platforms. If I were to publish on the pages of the Vancouver Sun or one of Andrew's publications a story about Donald Trump being an axe murderer, I would be held to account. The editors probably would not publish it in the first place, but there would be consequences. But I can publish stories like that end up on Twitter or on many other of the social media platforms. So those platforms are acting as publishers, and as publishers, they need to be accountable for that content. This gets more complicated when it is private conversations, and then that's when people get skittish and bring up freedom of speech. So I think democracy relies on us being able to hold thoughts and to express those thoughts, even if many people disagree with them. So I think that's a fundamental distinction. What is news and who is accountable for news, and what is conversations that still need to be civil and still need to have a certain level online, but the conversations as private citizens are a different story.
Well, thanks for setting that context, and thanks everyone for nicely setting the context for the discussion that is going to follow right now. And I've been taking notes and revising things so that actually this works out very well, because the pre-prepared questions I have to launch things, we've already gone in those directions. Just so that everybody else knows what direction we're going on. The first part of our general discussion here, I would have to say, will be in the area of what I'd say is platforms and / mediation or moderation, depending what you want to do. And so I'm going to start make a question in that area momentarily. We're then going to shift our discussion afterwards to this notion of trust and value, those two aspects of things. So the first prepared question we had here to get things going, but things are already going here, is a great deal of public discourse occurs on social media platforms or on platforms managed by traditional media. How can or should these discussions be mediated? What is the role of government, individuals, and companies? We've started hearing all of that too, and guess what? We have people that might be viewed as being representatives of, government, individuals, and companies, even wearing your own hats. So, Christine, why don't we go over to you if you want to, any part of that question you want to, wearing whatever hat you want to wear in terms of this. So this notion of platform and mediation, what is the role of government, individual, and or company?
I'll probably try to wear all the hats, but we'll try one at a time. I think the key is really diverse participation and representation. More than anything, it's important that all voices are there. And that's where I see government playing a role, is to try to help the underrepresented voices actually have a space, to make room for them and make sure that they are being heard. As individuals, we also have a great responsibility to ensure that we employ our critical thinking and our skepticism. As companies, we fall somewhere in the middle. We should also be critical thinkers, we should be skeptics, and we should make sure we don't stay away from the dark corners of the internet. Those places are never going away. And if we don't engage and if we don't provide counterweights and counter-information, things are going to thrive in those dark corners regardless. There's no way to stop people from having opinions, when we shouldn't. And I think we have to be careful that we don't start enforcing filtering and censoring and take it too far. There's certainly a level where we need to make sure people feel safe and protected. But censoring is something we should in itself always question and make sure that it's being used in a responsible way where it's actually providing the right value.
So Sue, on the issue of platforms and mediation, some initial thoughts that you have there in terms of, and feel free to argue with the other people on stage too,
No arguments. I think certainly Christine's work around diversity is something that I picked up on when we spoke last week. I think that for, I can't speak to regulation or public policy on this because I am just a lowly civil servant. But what I can say is that I think that for the bias and diversity, what I would say is that as somebody in government who cares a lot about making sure we're making the right decisions, it's almost the reverse of that, where I want to make sure that those voices that we're hearing when government speaks to, whether it's stakeholders or citizens, through all of the different channels that we do, that coming into it with that mindset of diversity is so important. And so that's why, if you might hear a really noisy corner of the internet talking about one thing or public opinion about something, but then if you talk to your friends and family, maybe that's a bit different. If you talk to more women or men or the LGBTQ plus community, it's going to be different. So I think that it's really important to just make sure that you've got that diversity. So for anybody that does research and cares a lot about sample size. And that's something, too, that I think needs to apply when it comes to citizen trust and engagement.
Sure. I mean, from our perspective, obviously we believe in free speech. We live in a democracy. But I can tell you that we have run into many, many situations where the choice of content coming from readers throughout, Western Canada have been more than of a concern. Clearly knowing where that line is when you post a comment, I believe people should have better perspectives on that line, but it seems like it has blurred out completely. And, part of it is that on our websites, we treat the websites very much like the paper. And it's interesting because a lot of people, if you go back and there was only an opportunity for people to send a letter into a newspaper, it's very different today that same person could send a letter into a newspaper, but what they would put in that letter is completely different to what they would post online. And whether it's because they're behind, a computer or on their cell phone and posting comments, it would be very different. So we have a very strict policy for print, and we have a strict policy for web. But as far as social is concerned, that is a race against time, and it does take a lot of labor to manage the social platforms. And I personally believe that Facebook and Google, the duopoly, should have a much bigger responsibility and accountability for many of the actions that they have, including all of the fake news sites, because unfortunately many people perceive those fake news sites to be real sites. And they take that content and share it with their friends, and their friends share it with their friends. And before you know it, it has, a lot of legs. And, that continues to be a big problem, certainly in our world.
Maite, is there anything you'd like to add, particularly in the context of whether wearing your own hat as an individual or because of what you now know about the media with all the informed opinion stuff you've been looking at?
Yeah, I think, I've been thinking about this, as I said, for a long time. And I'll just repeat the words of others. There was a wonderful event a couple of weeks ago as part of the Disinformation Summit that SFU organized. And Christopher Wheatley, the Facebook whistleblower, was there. And he said he often gets asked, what can you do as an individual? And he said, well, there are many things you can do. One is don't be nasty when you go online. But really, as individuals, we have little power. When we have power is when we go and appeal to those democratic institutions that are being challenged right now and tell our elected representatives, you need to do something. You need to ask Facebook and Google to monitor what's going on their sites and to not become fake news publishers. So, he said, tell people who have the power. And the other person who spoke there, or whose words I want to repeat, is David Frum. He's a senior editor at The Atlantic. And he said, well, pay for your news. I'm just going to love this. But really, that's what we've always done. You've just gotten used to a free online news. But he said, if you're not paying, you're being sold. So that's, I think, where we need to pay attention to who is paying for the news that you consume. And that brings me, if I may, to another point about advertising. And I think that's the original sin of the internet, the way we see it today. It's because it runs on ads, and ads require your attention, and your attention often stays there the angrier you are. So if people post things that incense you online, you stay there longer. So that's really a problem. And different models exist. Netflix survives and thrives, as far as I can tell, and they don't have ads. They still want your attention, but they don't use ads to run. So that I think that's the real problem, the use of ads and the platforms having so much power So we need to hold them accountable, I think.
Actually, you raised an interesting thing there we hadn't had in our preliminary discussion, the notion of advertisement and this notion of, okay, if you're not paying, you're being sold in that aspect. How is and this is for Andrew, just as a clarification here, for traditional media, how has because before there were the online platforms, you still had the printed paper and stuff like that, advertising would come in that. How has the advertising changed over the years?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously changed a lot. And I think that even goes back to Craigslist, Kijiji, the classified world, which, was a pretty solid pillar, or one of the pillars of the newspaper industry. That's definitely changed. People's budgets have diversified a lot between print and online. So those things have changed quite a bit as well. And media has to change with that at the same time, which is what every media endeavors to do. But one other just quick sidebar, Fred, if that's okay. I just also want to mention about the blurred lines of news and opinion. And I think, I did mention, CNN and Fox as an example, in the US, that people get very confused between what is news and a news story versus an opinion. And that line has absolutely blurred. And I think that in turn also sets challenges for the public to understand, is that a true statement or is it an opinion? Is it a fact-based story or is it an opinion? So I think that plays a big part in the confusion as well.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you raised that aspect of it too, the notion of opinion, and because the whole notion and that notion of news opinion versus fact, and because facts are something that are verifiable, or if you have data in terms of that, you can verify them.
Not being the data scientist, though, I would say that, like, a fact according to who? Like, there's always going to be a bias.
Yeah.
I've sat around the table with, plenty of the people in that space. So I think the blurred lines piece is so true, because you could have a news story put out by somebody who looks, it's credible, but they're still giving you their view, right? Whether they're a columnist or they are.
And that ties into an interesting distinction which we've seen over the years, this notion of data versus information versus knowledge.
Right.
From the same data, you can get all sorts of different kinds of information, and whole different areas, diverse areas of knowledge can be supported by the same data, depending on how selective that you're viewing there. So, but unlike physics, where it's clear what the data is, right?
There is no truth in science. There is just increasing levels of knowledge, but there is no truth. Everything is a theory. Very few things you can say have actually been proven.
Yes, and when you think of it the way you think about physics, our understanding of physics over the different from generation to generation, from century to century, how it's changed, and even to the point of, if you were arguing against the facts of the universe at the time, you could lose your life.
I would say if there's one thing that defines a scientist, it's being open for revising your ideas and perspectives.
Yes.
And that, more than anything else, is what's missing in today's discussions. It's not so much a matter of what's true and what's false. It's, are you open to having your worldview changed and questioned?
Yeah, and that notion, that is an important one. So, great discussion in terms of that. Feel free, somebody else, I just had a few notes here chiming in.
I have to make one comment though, because we're talking about how advertisement changes, and it changes how we want to skew how we present something to get attention. But that's also not a new thing, and let's call this one a fact for now. But I learned that in the first recorded, I think, case of fake news was in 1690, where one newspaper in the US was shut down for publishing fake news. A big difference between 1690 or now, though, is that people's trust in authority has changed. And that, I think, is actually a good thing, that we should question more, and we shouldn't blindly trust authority. So newspaper, for as long as they have existed, some newspapers, sorry Andrew.
No problem.
They need, whether it's through advertisement or subscriptions, they need to make money, and they do that by catching the reader's attention. And there are honorable ways of doing that, and there are questionable ways. So the concept itself is not new. I think our awareness of it has luckily increased very rapidly over the last few years, and there's an opportunity for us to really change things and have a positive impact.
One thing you also raised there is this notion of, like, we are here in Canada with a certain kind of political system and so on, but a lot of this news is in an international context, an international environment, and there's different regulations, different mechanisms in place in different countries. And just as a short follow-up to that, I'm going to, I know many of us, we were commenting before, I've lived in different countries, during our careers, but for a company that I know deals with media in multiple countries, and Hawaii is now, it was added as it was the 50th, yeah, Alaska was the 49th, and you're in the 49th as well. What do you see across the international, how much of an issue is what's happening in Canada from your perspective versus what's happening in the States versus the rest of the world?
I think we're pretty proud overall of the differences between the two. And obviously we're on the Canadian side of the border, and we still believe that there's a lot of truth and honesty in content. Responsibility, accountability, all those things are still fairly, we believe, strong on this side of the border. However, just a quick sidebar back to the advertising, it is a concern, for example, when the Canadian government would spend, more than half of their marketing budget on Facebook and Google. That kind of is a big shock. And then they offer, just I can share this, that with advertising agencies, and I've spoken to a number in Toronto, that there are grants given by the government, our government, to send advertising agencies south to learn and train with Facebook to come back to Canada to deploy marketing here in Canada on Facebook. Mm-hmm. Paid for by our tax dollars, which is wonderful. So there's definitely issues, and I know the Newspaper Association is really pushing hard on these kinds of things happening in Canada, and with no accountability and obviously not paying any taxes. So that's a whole nother aspect to the scenario.
We never have foreign influence financially in any of our goings-on in this country.
No,
that's
exactly.
Right. That's good, yeah. I'm going to wrap up pretty soon the discussion on this first point. Any other final points that people want to do on this first area, which I sort of dealt with in terms of platform and mediation?
Oh, right.
Yes. Bringing us back to it,
Yeah. I think we've covered it.
I think we've solved all those problems. That's trivial. Okay, that makes it easy. Okay, so check mark there. So wanted to move on to this second direction, which I might want to call, like I said, the notion of trust and value. Okay, so here's the official question for everybody out there that has not seen it ahead of time. How has technology changed the degree of trust in these discussions? And how do you see this changing in the future? Actually, has the value of these discussions changed? But can additional direct or indirect value be derived from the information shared in these discussions? So about trust, how has trust changed, and how has basically the value of the discussions changed? Instead of going in the ordinary order, I'm going to ask for a volunteer for who wants to speak first on this one, so that I can't be biased.
I can jump in. I think we're questioning a lot of what we're hearing, and I think, as Christine said, that's good. It's good to be critical thinkers. And when you think about the differences in who believes and doesn't believe fake news, don't think that it's people with no education. It's actually the people with a higher education just trust what they see online. Mm-hmm. So we need to, I think, have an informed citizenry who questions and engages with the dark corners when necessary, if they have the gumption to do it. So I think that's how trust has changed. We mistrust more, and I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. I also should say, we're going to flog the social media sites tonight, that there's lots of value there, and there's lots of really good discussions taking place, and they have allowed us to do things that we couldn't do before, from large scale. Their social media discussions are being used to track epidemics or fires, to small level. I'll tell you a story of how I became interested in online news comments. And this was when the latest teachers' strike, I think it was 2014-15 in BC. I was obsessively checking the news to find out when my kids were going to go back to school. So I started reading the comments, and I was shocked at what I found there. I was shocked to see that people thought so differently than me, and there was a lot of hate against teachers. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I am, after all, a teacher. I teach at a university. And I thought, why? So I still disagree with those people, but it allowed me to understand where they were coming from. There were many people that were upset that somebody else had, sort of okay pay, jobs for life, a pension, right? My reaction would have been to ask for those things for myself, rather than be upset about somebody else having them. But it sort of, I understood why there was not as much support for teachers. I thought before the strike that was a no-brainer, I mean, really? Teachers as objects of hate? But then I understood a lot of that. So then I applied for a grant to study news comments, and I got it, and I've been doing that for the last 4 years, and it's been fascinating. I've read all kinds of really awful things, really awful, but I've also learned a lot about different points of view. So that's where I think the value is, and that's where I think our perspectives have changed and things have changed. Maybe we have less trust, but we also learn a lot about each other. I mean, there were people in those fora that I would have never talked to before, right? So I think that's valuable.
Yeah, just on the trust note, I think one thing with our particular group, as I'm here, it's a collection of community organizations. So the people that work at these local community media operations, they live, they work, they play in those communities. And if you're in Smithers, or if you're in Prince Rupert, or Kelowna, or Victoria, you've got to be able to walk down that street, because you're probably going to know a good number of people in that community. So it really is very important that we are a trusted medium, because of the very nature. Who's going to want to walk down the street if you've just written a whole pack of lies? So that really we don't really come across that very often. People may not want to hear the truth sometimes, which is a whole different question. But then there also is a bit of censorship issues that I'll just touch on quickly, and I've dealt with a number of these myself, where somebody again would want to post on our site, and they've attempted to post 500 words on a comment, which obviously isn't normal. It's a major attack on the mayor or whomever they're attacking. And if we deem it to still be appropriate, even though they have an opinion about the mayor, that's fine. And typically we would run it. The problem is that is part of education, that same person, anywhere where there's any kind of connection to the city hall, these same 500 words start appearing everywhere. And then, the editor says, okay, we've already published it. It's been in print. It's been online. It's not going on another 300 stories on our websites. So they're removed. And that particular person, I think of right now, got extremely upset, to say the least. And so we explained, we're happy to hear from you. If you have another opinion on the mayor, if you really want to, then give us another opinion, but give us some fact with it. What don't you like? Was there a decision made? And a couple of weeks, go by, and the 500 words appear again. So, we are put in those situations sometimes, and this particular person is very well educated, I might add, and he's very knowledgeable, but he's very passionate about his opinion. So those things that we're up against, and then just finally going to a different demo, just to give you an example. We have been a part of many apprehensions, as it were, for crime. And the reason for it is that we would run a story on a drug bust, whatever it may be. And the people that were involved in the drug bust, literally, they're on social media. And they then pass to their friends, forgetting that it's in our string on our Facebook feed, right? So they say, Johnny, did you see this? That was lucky we weren't there. And then somebody else says, yeah, you didn't get back. They've actually given a whole account of the crime. And of course, we just pass that on to the police department and they go and make the arrest. So,
Darwin Awards category.
Exactly. So social media does have a good place sometimes.
There you go.
So there you go.
If I may, I've seen this same person posting the same comment over and over again. We have, I think, more than 1 million comments from different publications, from the Globe and Mail and from the Tyee locally, and you see this, word by word on whatever, on the entire newspaper, whatever section, business, health, the life and style section, and they have the same comments over and over again.
Cut and paste freedom of speech.
Absolutely.
Yep. Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's something to be said for when you now write letters to the editor, or even a handwritten letter, it will actually get noticed because they know it's unlikely to be cut and paste unless it's been scribed like with the quill and things like that. In terms of that. Back to the contemporary age and back to the question here. So it's Christine or Sue, either you care to comment on this notion of either of the trust and value?
I think that, the perspective that I have coming into this evening is that as a citizen, the topic fascinates me. And hearing this, I feel like I'm just sitting here taking notes and listening. For, the connection to the work that I see and the examples that I see in government, I think that the way that technology is influencing trust is some of the things that I see with respect to open data, which is a part of the world that I'm in. And I think that having information or data and making that available doesn't automatically just make it trustworthy. Now, having an authoritative source, for example, wildfire data is a fabulous example. So I think that this ties into, I think that making information available and making it accessible are two different things. So with wildfire example, you can make open data available about locations. It could be live data. It's authoritative data. But if you don't consider how to make it accessible to people, so by making real-time maps and having that information available, there's 2 points that follow from that. One is trustworthiness. If you get a complicated CSV file downloaded from some obscure page of government, it's not very trustworthy to be able to get the information you need. But if it's surfaced in a way that has data visualizations, then you're actually democratizing that data a little bit more. So I think that that's one of the ways in which technology is influencing trust. So I recognize that's a little bit of a shift away from the realm of fake news, but I think it comes down to that similar need that we have as citizens or consumers to be able to critically think about the information you're given and then do something with it, which I think at the end of the day is pretty vital. A quick sidestep from that line of thought around trust and technology. Earlier on, I spoke about this concept of data literacy and the work that I'm doing inside of government, and my soapbox about wanting to do more with the public. Social license for using data and using disruptive new technologies is vital, and having a public that understands the implications is important. And yesterday, I actually just heard about the government of Finland that is, and they have recognized that artificial intelligence is it's one of their economic drivers all across the EU. There's AI is everywhere, and I know Trevor knows where this is going from SFU. So one of the things that they did was they created a public course in AI that was an online free course for anybody to take. And I thought this was great. It was music to my ears. And they used a term that I want to start using, which is about the fact that this is the civic competency. I think I used it earlier. It's not my term, but I'll start using it. Because I think it's bang on in this day and age. And when it comes back to trust, what I'd say there is like, who's behind it or what's behind it. And this isn't tinfoil hat, scary. It could just be, where are you getting information from, and is that really a person? And that's the reality. So it could be about who's giving you your advice for your insurance claim, or it could be news, but it's kind of that same level, and creating that awareness and understanding among the public about what that actually means, I think will go a long way.
Thanks for raising that. And as an AI researcher, thank you for plugging the AI research there.
I gotcha.
Yeah. Christine, over to you on a comment on the notion of trust and value.
Absolutely. I have a huge problem with the word trust. Because the thing is, I don't really trust it. Trust is not inherently good. So we have to be very careful in this discussion that we don't equal trust with something good and something to strive for. Blind trust is terribly, terribly bad. So when we talk about trust, we need to put some parameters around it. And trust is something you have to earn for a good reason. And I don't want any of you here tonight to trust me. I want you to think. And the issue today, to me, is not so much a lack of trust, but misplaced trust. Because unfortunately, our human nature is kind of that we want to trust something. It goes back a little bit again to, we want things to be easy, we want things to be understandable and comprehensible. And I totally get that. I'm not different. But we shouldn't just trust things. We should look for evidence and ask for people and sources to explain to us why. Why should we trust them? And trying to tie in what's good about social media and what's good about all this information, I think for me it's really helped me broaden my horizons. Because I have access to opinions and news and information that I otherwise wouldn't have had access to. I follow people on social media that are very different than I am, have different backgrounds, different experience, and different worldviews, and it makes me look at things differently. And on a daily basis, I listen to the news on the radio, I listen to 2 news podcasts, and I read 3 online newspapers. And they're all published in 3 different countries. And it's amazing how different the same story is being presented in what I have to admit are non-partisan news outlets. So even though they're on paper, pun intended, similar, they still represent the stories very differently. And before social media and before easy access to the internet, I wouldn't have been able to afford subscribing to 3 paper copies of a paper, for example. So it really helps me, again, broaden my horizons and also look at the same issue from different angles. And I think, to me personally, that's extremely valuable.
Brilliant observation there about misplaced trust. And yeah, the notion, people, it's so often it's presented as, trust is something, it's foundational and stuff like that, but you need to have those modifiers before it and afterwards to figure out what are you trusting in. So any other, some good points, just going to wrap up our conversation shortly in terms of this before we move to the final question. Any comments on what Christine just said, or any other comments what we've just heard here?
Just one other sidebar, another example on the social media side, the wildfires, reminded me of another example. That Williams Lake, 100 Mile House, and Cache Creek area that suffered major wildfires. You may have seen the story that a group of people had posted, a planned route to leave, a safe route to leave that area or those various areas, and it was fake. And they were pushing people, into an area where in fact, it was very dangerous. And they used social media to do that. And, they thought it was very funny. And so there's another example, unfortunately, where social media, in a real world setting and in our own backyard, we're not talking, another country here, that it has a very powerful effect because, to your point, people trusted that information even though it didn't come from a verified source.
That's a really good example. Any other comments before we move to a short wrap-up before we open it up for questions to the audience? So the last question, all those other ones were really long. So this way we're going to have hopefully a short final question, but I'll let them go on longer if they want to for the answers. So it's a nice, simple question. What are the solutions? Other than buying more newspapers, pay for your subscriptions and stuff like that. So, Christine, you want to start? What are the solutions?
So the question was short, but the answer doesn't have to be, right?
That's correct.
Okay. I would start by saying, what is the problem? What is the problem we're trying to solve? Because is it that people don't see the truth, or is it that they don't see our truth? So there are plenty of examples of fake news that have spread, and that could have been a story where someone gets falsely accused of something terrible, a mob assembles and pursue or potentially abuse this person. That's of course not okay. But what if the accusations have been correct? What if the news story had been correct and the accusations true? Is it okay then? Hopefully the answer is of course not. So there's a difference between fake news being an issue and how people react to fake news being an issue, or react to fake news. So what I think we're talking about tonight is multiple issues, and we have to make sure that we keep them sometimes distinct and don't all lump them together. I'm not saying that fake news isn't a problem. I think it absolutely is, and it's something I'm very concerned about. But I also think what we see as sometimes as acceptable behavior and how we respond to news, whether true or false, is another issue that we need to be aware of and address as well. Because the thing is, if fake news didn't fill a need in people, people wouldn't be susceptible to it. So rather than just talking about fake news and how do we counter fake news, I think we need to talk more about what is the need that fake news is filling? What is it that makes people susceptible to fake news? And I think education is part of it. And I don't mean higher education. I mean education in understanding how to question and be critical. And you can be very, what we traditionally call, highly educated without having those skills. So it's about critical thinking, and it's about preserving equity in my mind. So always question within reasonable limits, but also again be open to having your views challenged and to revising your views and what you hold to be truth or false.
Great.
Sort of
Thank you
short.
very much. Yes.
Shortest.
Yes.
Great.
Sue, over to you.
I'm just going to go home now. That was great.
Yeah.
I think that your question on what is the problem we're trying to solve is really an important one because, we've got the blurred lines of everything that we've been talking about. So if I come back to, okay, well, what are we trying to solve? There's quite a few things, I think. And what I would say is that I think that however we're going to find our truth, critically think, I think that having more conversations is better, and I think that having a diversity of opinion is important. I was speaking to Fred when we were in the other room. I was going to say the warm-up. We weren't really warming up, but there we go, the green room. About some work that some of his colleagues at SFU are doing with respect to data and visual analytics. One of the things that I think is so exciting is when there are opportunities to bring together those different voices. And I don't mean different voices just like the four of us sitting on a stage and the rest of you here and we'll have a drink and a talk and the rest of it. But I also mean that when you're coming towards these tough challenges or these tough constructs in our life, bringing in different skill sets and different opinions. So you might have somebody who knows, a lot about a particular, computational linguistics methodology, and then you might have someone that knows how to understand, has a finger on the pulse of what the communities are saying, like that you've got. So I think that having a diversity of opinion and a diversity of tools to be able to get there is the way to do that, and find opportunities to engage the public. So whatever it is that we are doing, whatever problem we are solving, I think finding constructive ways to get a diversity of opinion, talking about it, and critically thinking is good. And then also informing those, like you said, tell your elected officials what you want. Yeah, democracy. Yeah.
Andrew, over to you.
Okay, well, I'm going to start by saying that there's no easy answer here. We're definitely on a path that continues to be more challenging. Certainly from a media perspective, we see that every day, and we do see it escalating. I'd love to sit here and say this is the solution to change the path, but I can't at this point. But what I do know is, echoing my colleagues here, that we do need to reach out more to communities and organizations and get feedback, get the ownership, help with the education, and just demonstrate some of the challenges that we all face, because it's not just an individual or an organization. It's everybody is accountable for behavior and their online presence specifically. But I also think that we do need to hold the two big guns accountable. And I do think that they do get away with way too much. And I think that is not helping the situation at all. But from our perspective, we want to maintain that open communication, the limited censorship as the example I gave you just now. But certainly we want, free mind, free spirit, and be able to reflect what the community thinks in any given community, and be able to provide that as a big picture for, whether it's across Western Canada or for a region or an individual community, as it were. And I think ultimately, we need to definitely deal with this, because it is going to continue to move in a direction that I don't believe anybody's going to be happy with. So we need to figure out solutions between us all.
Okay, thank you very much. And Maite, over to you before we open it up for questions. So now's the time that you're all thinking about your questions, right? Okay, good. Maite, over to you.
I'll just repeat a couple of the things that I said about talking to your representatives. So maybe tell your MP you don't want them to send people to Facebook using your tax dollars. And we can ask government to hold companies accountable. There are different legislations that these companies are subject to. So for instance, in Germany, if you post anything about Holocaust denial, it has to come down within 24 hours. And Twitter and Facebook bring it down within 24 hours, or they face a big fine because Germany has very strict legislation around that. So they know how to do it. They just, don't do it unless they have to. The other thing that I mentioned about paying for news, maybe, you don't want to pay for 3 subscriptions, but if you're not paying, then think who is, think where the money is coming from. I think that's important. And one last thought, there's something I've read on Twitter where I read very many interesting things. This was something that Chantal Hubert, the journalist, mentioned a few days ago. When you're posting online, she didn't say, I'm paraphrasing, she didn't say when you're posting, but think, if my kid said this to their teacher, what would happen? If I said this to my boss, what would happen? If I said this to my spouse, what would happen? And if you have qualms about that, then maybe you shouldn't be posted. And if you see somebody, and that's what Christine was talking about with engaging with people, if you see somebody posting something really offensive, maybe ask them that question. Would you say this to your boss? Would you say this to a close friend? You don't have to call them names, just ask them that question, right? So I think that's one place where individual responsibility has a place, to keep discussions civil online.
That's great. Thank you for that context there. And right now we have a couple of people with mics who have questions. So if you have questions, raise your hand. And first person will be right here. And Tanya, you take that question. Next person will be right there afterwards.
So I'm a little concerned in the nature of the discussion because we've assumed that all the bad actors are single lone point individuals. The data scientists, the computer scientists in the room will know about Metcalfe's law, where the power of the network is directly proportional to the square of the number of nodes in that network. So when you take a network that's powerful and you couple it with orchestrated fake news or material that are then pushed by bots and farms in Central Europe, and that material is also architected carefully to speak to the very nature of why it feeds that need in those individuals. So it's a mixture of psychology, big dollars paying for big results, pushing big. The solutions that you've talked to, I fear, are woefully inadequate. So what would your solutions be for dealing with those big, massive bad actors that are orchestrated with purpose in mind?
Good question. Anybody like to field that one?
Excellent point. And I think that's where the accountability lies. Who is paying for that content? How is it making its way into the platforms? The platforms know which accounts are bots and which ones are not.
They don't care because they're making money. So accountability is a false narrative.
But we can demand it, right? That's what I think, where we can demand it and we can ask governments to legislate that.
But I think one problem there is to, of course, things cross country boundaries, right? And just because something is potentially illegal and enforceable in Canada doesn't mean it's illegal where it's originating. And that's where when I say we shouldn't just focus on trying to stop fake news, it's because I think we can't. I don't see how that's going to happen. I would love for it to be possible. I just don't see it. So I think it's more important to try to address again why people are susceptible to it. What is the need it's filling? And of course, what's the reaction if you forbid something or if you outlaw something, if you stop it? There's a counter reaction that's sometimes even stronger. So it's not about going to people and say, your truth is wrong, your truth is false. It's looking more at why are people looking for those answers? What is it that we, maybe as a government, is not providing, as a city, as the community, as people? And trying to understand that better instead of trying to play the whack-a-mole game.
Andrew or Sue, anything to add?
Not particularly beyond the fact that it's a great point. And it is something that we continue to grapple with as well. We haven't talked about it on the stage, obviously, to your point. But it is very important, and it does have a major impact on society as a whole.
Look at Brexit.
Yeah.
Look at Rohingya.
You bet.
Right? You know,
There's many.
many
Sue, anything
mass
else that you'd like to
scale
add?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, just making sure we have time to go to different questions. Next person will be over here, and then people on this side can just gesture to Tanya. And so Tanya, you'll choose somebody there. Yes. Okay, over to you here.
My question is more on influence news. As we all know, all media news publication companies are controlled or influenced by their own interest groups, which means all news are biased in some ways. So how do we know if our news distributions, systems, or companies are still trustworthy?
Who would like to speak to that one?
I can start if you like.
Okay.
So it's a great question. And there's absolutely many examples out there which are fairly obvious that it's slanted because it's not only one story typically. You know, you will see repeated stories and repeated angles along the same vein, and that, you know, becomes synonymous with that particular source. I can speak to ours, that the owner of our company, there have been times where he has requested content. There's no question about that. But what I would say is that over the 20 plus years I've been with Black Press Media, I can count that on one hand. So that's first of all. And we actually talked about this today with regards to another scenario. And the one thing that the owner says is, with those 5 examples, is that I really want this particular story to appear across my network, right? He owns the network, and you know, the fact it's 5 in 20-something years, I don't think that's a bad ratio since he is the owner. However, he also says that I expect you as journalists to make sure that you give the other side of the story. And we have done that on those occasions. And you know, they've been quite significant in content, but we've always told the other side of the story as well. So that would be a personal scenario. But sometimes, you know, local media is a little different to national media. It plays a very different game.
Great. I was going to say good data point. I'd say good information point there.
Yes.
In terms of that. So, any other people care to speak to that one there? No. There was a question over there with the microphone. Yep. Go for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been very interesting. I feel like we've been talking a lot about information systems, and I'd like to maybe just think about psychological systems, because I feel like that's the other end. I didn't really hear any discussion about algorithms, and I maybe just want to see if anyone wants to mention that. And perhaps a side reference is you may be familiar with Yuval Noah Harari, who speaks a lot about hacking the mind and how the real challenge is not so much to for computers or AI to know ourselves perfectly, but to know ourselves better than we know ourselves. The tendencies tends to be that as people are less and less self-knowledgeable of themselves and self-critical, critical of their self-knowledge, that seems to be, I feel, a challenge, and the reason why perhaps people could be so susceptible. I just wanted to make the distinction between critical self-knowledge, which I think is looking inwards, from critical thinking, which is looking outwards. So if you really trust this media source, you may take it as a way to be a critical thinker. Mm-hmm. But if you're not aware internally of your biases, then it just distorts things. Another question is, when does this become a public mental health issue? And is that an angle, a way to approach it from a governmental perspective? And that a possible response is to imagine algorithm detox. So in the same way as we have a healthcare system when our body is ailing, well, if our mind is ailing, there should be it should be a public public system responsibility to take people and say, you know what, you've been so algorithmically trained in this direction that there's a way to algorithmically reverse all your blind spots and all of that.
So you raised quite a few points there.
And
you know what, there's quite a few questions there, so why don't we just focus the panel here on,
sure.
You raised a good thing about the psychological aspects. Right. So would people like to speak to some of the psychological aspects? Because we've not been talking that much about that. Anybody care to speak to that? Otherwise, my background, cognitive science, I'll start talking.
I'll just have to mention groupthink, of course, is a big issue, right? We are very influenced by other people's opinion, and if someone, it's a little bit like the first voice to be heard, we tend to follow that voice. It's how it works in discussions, and we like that comfort, and we like being part of a group, and to some extent, I think that's what we're looking for, is that comfort of being part of a group, and today, there is a group for everyone. Doesn't matter what your opinions or views are, you can find your tribe or your community. And I think, to your point about self-reflection, trying to be critical of ourselves and understanding our own motives and motivations and what attracts us with certain groups and why a new story feels true to us is important.
I think we could probably spend a very long time on algorithms and, talking about that in a lot more detail, but just, from a simplification point of view and reflecting the tribes in terms of following and content. A classic example, on many of our sites where there's a very controversial issue. And one of the challenges that we have in social media is that people will read a headline and they suddenly know the entire story and they will then roll a whole bunch of comments on that particular story, and like-minded people will say, yeah, no, I agree with that. And as you go down to about comment 20, you'll see, if you guys actually bother to read the story, you'll see here's where the facts are, and that actually didn't take place.
Yeah.
And then it slowly starts, coming to a halt again. The other comments never change, but the self-policing in that respect, is a bit of a godsend for us, because a lot of people do correct people automatically for not actually getting the facts of the story, and they just scan the headlines.
Or not, yeah. And how often is the person that writes the headline different than the person who writes the story?
Yeah.
Whole separate discussion there.
Yes.
So we have a question right there.
Yeah. So I fear that the current rhetoric around fake news is sort of stressing upon the institutionalization of news on the account of citizen journalism, for example. And then speaking of other parts of the world, citizen journalism has been a phenomena that has led news, actual news, and has caused real change on the ground, especially in authoritarian regimes where freedom of expression and speech is at stake. Mm-hmm. So I believe that stressing upon critical sort of criticizing skills or questioning trust as a skill by itself is the right way to go, instead of maybe channeling that towards institutionalizing news as the alternative.
Does anybody want a quick comment on that one?
Just quickly, from my perspective, I would say the user-generated content, citizen journalism, very, very important in our business. We really like to hear from people, and that's really where a lot of our news comes from. And particularly when you're referring to overseas, that is equally important. But it's whoever then picks that story up, it's beholden upon them to make sure they then do the research that goes with the story that's been generated from that particular person. But it's a very good point.
Yep. We're going to go to 4 quick questions, 2 from each side, so make it very concise. Who has the mic on this side for a quick question?
My question is you're all familiar with the Streisand effect, where you're in the act of trying to ban some piece of information, it suddenly becomes hot and sexy and everyone knows about it, like when Barbara Streisand sued these geographers, who took a picture of her house. Instead of just being in some obscure university database, then millions of people suddenly were able to look into her house, right? But with banning, provocative or comments or fake news, how does one avoid that problem of making it sexy and catchy and legitimizing it inadvertently?
Anybody care to comment on that one?
It's a real problem. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we know that was the answer. What is the problem? Yeah, so we know one of it is a problem. Yes.
And research shows that when you publish, that something else was a fake news story, then you just distribute it further.
That's right.
So when any retraction just draws attention to the original content.
Yeah. So that was the quick question there. A quick question on this side here.
Hi. So we've been talking a lot about citizen trust and how that ties into user-generated content and the news and so on. But I work in public and stakeholder engagement, and a lot of times the mistrust that seems to be coming is that the people I'm talking to or working with seem to believe that there is misinformation that's coming from decision makers or from government itself. So I was at an event last week where somebody raised the fact that they believed that TransLink was fudging numbers in their reports to support their agenda and so on, right? And so, and we know that historically, government has not necessarily always been 100% transparent with the public either, and which kind of leads to this catch-22 where people then turn to fake news because they don't believe that the government is providing information. And so, so how would you propose, or what are your thoughts on actually rebuilding that trust with diverse communities so that, whether it's a baseline level of information or making the information that exists more accessible or more understandable? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Anybody care to take that one? Sue?
I think what I would say is that there's lots of pieces of that are interesting. But I think that it's about that mixed modes of actually having that engagement. So, people can point very quickly to fake news if it's an opinion they don't like or it's something that they don't like. Engaging with the public is always a tricky business, right? But I think that I would just say that I don't think that an algorithm or a website can solve that problem. I think humans can solve that problem, and I think they do that by being reasonable and talking, and ideally having some vulnerability, but that's not always possible.
Great, thanks. Final quick question from this side and then one from this side. Who has the mic there?
I was just wondering, how much we just discussed. I came in a little bit late, but we discussed some issues and some problems we have been facing. But how much actually news organizations or media outlets are making efforts to prevent or to face those issues? Are we hiring? You guys are hiring more fact checkers. For example, Washington Post. Their department is growing, getting bigger, because they realize that they need more fact checkers. Or are they using more big data tools, for example, to gather more complicated data, for example, SQL, Python, R, there are tons. And then those are tools that data journalists really use to struggle with, to collect all the data. I do data by myself, but those are really huge tools. How much news these days, news media outlets making effort to utilize those tools to prevent, those issues?
Just quickly, I've seen this continue to grow, certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, more than ever. And using more and more data, we're having to look for the right kind of people to be able to understand the data. Because if you're not used to that, or it's not been in your history, as a reporter, as an example, it doesn't always come naturally. So we are definitely reaching out to more skill sets to understand how that data can be used better. And it definitely is playing a bigger role, there's no question about it.
And the last question before we open to the general networking, where we can ask anybody any questions while we're around the food.
Right here. Thank you. So I really like the concept of civic competence. And I also believe, as you do, that it's really important to question who we trust, why we trust, what we trust. So my question is, for anybody really, what is the role of government or media organizations or civic institutions like Simon Fraser University or others in improving citizen competence in thinking about how we trust, why we trust, how to trust or not trust what we see and hear every day?
How about we'll wrap up by everybody being able to spend 20 seconds responding to that, starting with Maite. How about you?
Well, I think you summarized that we need to bring everybody together, media organizations, government, public institutions, and people from different backgrounds to think about these issues.
Very quickly, it's all about facts. I have been in situations where I have known various politicians, let's throw that one out to start with, and I've been supremely amazed when we actually got the facts, that what they were actually telling us, and we had a pretty good relationship in a number of different markets, that it was in fact not true. And, you know, so it's very important, and we push that very strongly to make sure that everything is factually checked, regardless of the relationship with the person in government.
Sue?
I think more opportunities to come together. It's something that I know I care lots about, and I'm hoping to have more conversations with those that want to continue it. But I think that it's figuring out how to connect the dots and the right people to have that conversation.
Christine?
I'm going to give the opposite answer. Decentralize instead. Meet people at their own level and provide information where people are accessing information / facts / fake news, real news, whatever it is. Meet people, again, where they are, using the language and the tools that works for them, which means you're going to have a lot of different ways to deliver your message. Be present and be engaged.
Well, I want to please join me in thanking all of our panelists for their insight today. Great. And thank you very much for the questions. I know there were more questions we couldn't get to, so this way we can continue to have those discussions. So like I mentioned before, there are also refreshments in the back. And I guess sort of to summarize some of these things where we were getting at with all of this, I really like this notion of, you know, we were looking for the solution. We know that the answer is 42, but the problem was we really don't know what the problem is. So many of us have different problems that we need to solve, depending on what our background is, whether it's individual, societal problems for our companies or organizations. Quite often, if you end up talking to me when I wear my hat as scientific director of the Big Data Initiative, as Avi or as Trevor, my colleagues there will comment on, I say, if you have data and you have a problem, come talk to us. And the ultimate thing there, what's interesting, sometimes the problem is just that you need to learn about something. Sometimes it may be a technical problem. Sometimes you may not even know what that problem is. It's just that because of the environment you're in, you know you have to start taking some action to change things and maybe to get value from things. So I wanted to view this as a starting point for the discussion. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. I'm looking forward to the continued discussion. Thanks, everyone.